So first of all, thank you very much. I think we're now up to almost 70 people who have joined us for this Women in Journalism event, which we're very proud to be holding 4 days before COP, which everyone's always said that every climate summit is the one that is absolutely crucial, but it certainly appears that this one really is going to be the meeting that could perhaps determine the future of our entire planet. And it's also great to see so many women journalists who have been leading the reporting in this area. If for no other reason than we know that so many women are impacted by climate crisis. And it's just great that finally it feels like there is a kind of balance in the voices who are telling the stories that need to be heard. To mark this event and the COP summit, Women in Journalism has commissioned a series of features on environment journalists working around the world, to sort of as a resource there for other journalists moving into the profession, but also an opportunity, I think, for women working in this field to sort of talk about their learnings, their concerns and their fears. So, and we're delighted to bring together this panel today of experts to sort of talk about what they've learned and what they feel still needs to be done in this field. So if I can just introduce everybody, we have Emiliya Mychasuk, who is the climate editor at the Financial Times, recently sort of put into that job, I think, earlier this year, at the time that the FT decided to create a climate capital, which is a hub of all that content. Interestingly, because so many of your business readers are interested in accessing high quality content on this topic. And we're also joined by Ugochi Oluigbo, who is joining us from France, but ordinarily, you have been working as an environment reporter in Nigeria, I believe, if that's correct. And you've sort of been a presenter of a flagship climate program in Nigeria and done an awful lot of work on how it's impacted people's lives there. We've also got Fiona Harvey, who is the environment correspondent for The Guardian, who I believe you've been writing in this field for, I think, about 17 years, Fiona. There was a great quote where I think you said that for about 17 years you've been banging your head against a brick wall. Hopefully you no longer feel that, and you'll be able to talk to us a little bit about how that has changed. And then also we're delighted from the Philippines to be joined by Fatima Arkin, who has got a whole plethora of awards to her name, is working from the country which ranks, I think, as the most vulnerable to climate change in anywhere in the world, according to the Institute of Economics and Peace. And the work that you've been doing there, I think you want to speak very much about who are telling the stories around climate crisis and how those stories are told. So why don't we start then maybe with you, Fatima? I think could we perhaps argue that the fact that we're in such a difficult situation at the moment with climate crisis, with things seems to have reached a real terror situation, a real horror situation, is it that perhaps because journalists haven't done their job well enough? We didn't get this story out there soon enough?
I think everybody always feels like we don't get the story out soon enough. Just like you say, every COP also, we feel like it's the most important COP. And so there's always that real sense of urgency. But also as journalists, we just try as hard as we can to get those honest stories out there and to get as much diverse lived experiences out there as possible.
But I mean, do you feel though it's taken a long time to get the kind of mass interest in this as a subject that is necessary to affect change?
Absolutely, absolutely. I was just thinking back to, when I was doing reporting on Super Typhoon Haiyan back in 2013, and part of it is getting that story out there, but also part of it is people understanding climate change also in the developing world. And when that happened, and when I ask people, I like to ask people as well, do you know what climate change is? And the response I would get to that wouldn't, people, while they didn't understand the science of it, they could explain it in their own terms and they noticed things were changing, but they couldn't particularly make sense of it. And so I definitely think that over the years, we are getting closer and closer to that. But yeah, it definitely is taking quite a long time to do that.
I mean, Fiona, going back to that point that I sort of made earlier, that, for a long time, it must have felt that you were writing, really important stories. And did it become frustrating that they weren't getting the mass attention that you felt they deserved?
Yes. I mean, one of the problems with the climate is that, for a long time, we were writing stories saying these are things that are going to happen in the future. Sometimes talking about things that would happen in 2050 or beyond. And people are just not very good at thinking about that. People aren't very good at warnings or, long-term issues. And another thing that was difficult then, and that is less difficult now, is attributing extreme weather to climate change. So obviously extreme weather also happens naturally. We get storms and droughts and floods and hurricanes naturally. So for a long time, it was difficult for climate scientists to say, this extreme weather is because of climate change.
Yes.
And now that science has moved on a great deal, and now you can say even a specific storm or so on has been made worse by climate change, has been made much more likely by climate change and so on. And so we are now seeing these impacts in the real world. So it's unfortunate really that it's taken us to actually see this with our own eyes rather than to be warned about it in order for anyone to think about doing anything.
Do you sometimes feel as well, Fiona, that maybe a lot of time was wasted having a debate around climate crisis rather than actually just presenting it as facts? It's felt like we spent years debating whether it was even a thing.
Yeah, well, that was the fault of the fossil fuel lobby, mainly. And there's a lot of vested interests lined up against climate change. So they were creating doubt around climate science long after there was any actual doubt about climate science. They were trying to give that impression that it was a matter of opinion rather than a matter of scientific fact. And unfortunately, many newspapers colluded with them in that.
Ugochi, I'm interested in, so you were fronting a TV program in Nigeria on environment and climate. How did you manage to make it a topic that people wanted to tune into? Because I mean, this is the challenge, isn't it? How do you make it something that they'd rather watch that than, the latest soap opera or latest film or whatever? Talk to us about how you managed to make it interesting.
Thank you very much. I first want to thank everyone who started this journey before me, those who have done it for 25 years, 30 years. Thank you so much. You laid the right foundation for all of us. And then I would say I made it interesting for people because, as I said in my interview, I was right there with them. If you see my videos, I was in the flood. I wasn't too pretty to be inside there. I wasn't too pretty to be, to just tell the story from afar. I was there living with them, living their realities with them. So people saw that and they loved it so much. They had never seen anything like that before, and I had over 100 episodes of this show going on every day. I was a news anchor. I read the news very well, but people preferred me. They say, oh, Ugochi, green angle. That's all they knew. And in the environmental issues, it wasn't popular. People care more about finding food to eat. They care more about even killing those animals you're talking about protecting. But they listen, they learn. When people tell me, they see me, they say, because of you, I've changed this. Because of you, I now understand this. Because of you, even kids. And that makes me feel so proud of my work. So yes, I think it's because I tell the stories. I find the characters. I find those who are most affected, the most vulnerable, and I amplify their voices, using video and telling these stories the right way that it should be told. And I also tell the truth. When I go to a community where I know the oil company is to blame, I say what the truth is. I don't try to cover it up. I don't try to, and then of course, we know in Nigeria, sometimes they say, oh, they give you a brown envelope and then you don't say the truth. But no, I don't take that. I say the reality. This is what it is. This is who is doing this. And this is how it's affecting these people. So I think that's really what, attracted people to the program.
I mean, as Fiona mentioned there a moment ago, there's a lot of people with a lot of money who have a big vested interest in avoiding conversations around climate crisis. I mean, was there any times in your reporting where you rubbed up against people like the oil companies who just did not want those stories told?
Absolutely, absolutely. I've had a story told, and then when I reported this story and I traveled, I was not in the country, and then I heard that they came back to the office to say, oh, can you report another angle on the story? And I said, no, but that's not the reality. The people are still complaining. I think it was about the pipe-borne water that was polluted by an oil company. So when people open their taps, it runs like petrol, like you smell petrol. Yes, and they have to drink this. So I reported on that story. And when I traveled, someone called me, oh, they came to the office to say, can you report something differently? And I said, I mean, I can't control what the office, would report when I'm not there. But there have been cases like that where they come out to say, oh, can we have a meeting with you? Can we talk with you? But sometimes I don't oblige them because I know what they plan to do.
Interesting. And I mean, Emiliya, this is particularly interesting, I guess, for the FT's readership, because quite often a lot of your readership are the people with the money. They're the oil companies. They're people that have made money out of fossil fuels over. What are these people looking for in the reporting around climate crisis?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, it's interesting to hear Fiona also because, the FT's had climate coverage for some time, including, more than 2 decades, including when she led it. The vested interests, if anything, have not have increased. They haven't gone away because it's gone well beyond the fossil fuel companies. Now it's all companies are concerned about the impact on their business. So it's a constant battle, I think, has been and continues to be a constant battle to sort of deal with those vested interests. And we have a sort of issue at the moment. It's always been the case where companies try to go around the expert reporter and to go to another reporter who may not be as across all of the issues to do with climate change. And we also have a challenge that being a business audience, even the extremely sort of far-sighted people are very solutions oriented. So they sort of say, oh, we know all the disaster, we don't want to know about that anymore. We got it, we get it. We're not climate deniers, we totally get it, but what are some of the solutions? So they keep using this word solutions. And that's not a bad thing. It's not a bad way to be focused when we're writing, to think about, okay, well, what are some of the answers? But of course, they're very complicated answers, and they suit different businesses differently. So yes, and then you have people at all ends of the spectrum. For example, the Bill Gates end, which we're all familiar with, where he's sort of techno evangelist and he's full of techno optimism. And that it's tempting to be drawn into that. We have to temper the coverage of that as well.
I think I'd like to move on now. Fatima, to come back to you, because I think there's an area that you've sort of done quite a lot of work in, is your concern about how in the West a lot of climate crisis environment is reported, which perhaps has sort of created this idea of making victims of people living in southern countries, and that actually that's not really been particularly helpful at all. What do you think the problem is there, and what can be done about it?
Challenge with that is obviously you're talking to an audience that maybe some of them have never actually been to Asia or haven't been to Africa. And so you're trying to tell these stories are happening on the other side of the world and make them relate to it or make them care about it. And so often what I see is you have these articles that lead with, a very colorful story about a farmer or a fisherman, or perhaps, sex trafficking that's made worse by the typhoon. And of course, these things are legit, they're happening, and people here are very much struggling. The challenge is when people focus on the color and they don't dig deeper into the nuance, and we kind of stay on fishermen and how that's presented. And so sometimes when I talk to people here, frustration is, that's on how people start viewing themselves. And that's what people see. And even when I talk to friends back in Canada or back in the West, sometimes you'd be forgiven to think that, the entire country is just made up of farmers who struggle with the typhoon, when there's a lot of complexity here, a lot of nuance, and you're not getting those fresh perspectives and those different lived experiences that I wish people would dig into more.
But what's the solution there? Fiona, just to bring you in at this point, isn't the challenge that to make sort of these quite complex issues interesting to an audience who might be sat in London or Manchester, it is about colour and it is about human stories? What's the answer?
Well, climate is a story that has everything, really. It has politics, it has business, it has science, it has, it encompasses the whole future of the planet. Most of all, it is about people, and we need to keep people at the forefront of this and keep this as a human story. I think that's really, really important. And I think, in some ways that human angle has tended to be obscured in the past. But we need to bring that to the forefront. That doesn't mean there can't be stories about politics or business or science or whatever in the mix. But we need to keep bringing this back to actual people, because I think that's what readers respond to. They respond to narratives and to stories from real people. It's tricky. Not every story needs that. Not every story is going to be based on sort of, someone on the ground in the front line of the climate crisis. But as long as we do ensure that that perspective is somewhere in our writing, I think that's really important.
But coming back to you on that point, Fatima, I mean, how do you think the Western media can better report on the people on countries that have been impacted by climate crisis without sort of using people and without victimizing people? What is the answer?
Well, I just want to say that, I mean, I'm not against human interest stories, and I'm not against, having that color. My problem is when it doesn't dig deeper beyond that, when it kind of just uses a few sentences painting the picture of a farmer and then goes into just the very superficial level. So for me, it's about getting deeper and digging deeper. If we do want to tell human stories, I mean, can we dig deeper, talk about more diverse experiences? Because there are other people living here that are also affected by climate change, beyond just farmers, beyond just that, because then it paints a very specific image. And I think it's not that it's one story or another story, but it's just many stories just end up that way. So how can we address this? How can we change it? I think telling more diverse experience, telling more human interest stories of the diverse lived experiences of people who are affected by climate change, and also talking about climate solutions. Because there are people here who are doing things, and they're not just sitting here waiting for a solution.
Ugochi, can I come to you on that point as well? I mean, what do you feel about climate crisis reporting in the West that you've read? I mean, do you feel it's fair, it's accurate, it's been good enough?
You're talking to me?
Yes, sorry.
Okay, yes. Okay, a lot of times I don't feel that it's been fair. For example, when I read a lot of articles about, say, renewable energy, I read about how beautiful it is, it is a solution, but people hardly write about the mining communities where these resources will be coming from. What is the effect on the children who are mining these minerals, and the mothers and the women, on their water and their land? So we say, oh, that's the future, that's the green, and we're buying these beautiful cars that are energy friendly just to, for me, it's a lot of times it's greenwashing, because they're taking the problem to those who can't even find food to eat. You're worsening the crisis for them. So I think it's important for us to balance that out. Let's always find out what does it mean for the community where this mineral will be coming from? What does it mean for the Niger Delta people? A lot of times we just say, oh, the oil companies, we talk about oil and how good it is and our cars and how cheaper it should be. But what about the Niger Delta? How do we clean up the mess in the Niger Delta? So I think we should, as she said, dig deeper into this. For me, dig deeper, find out the impacts on the people most affected, the most vulnerable, especially in those communities that mine the solution, quote unquote, the solution to the climate crisis.
And Emiliya, coming to you, I think on that point you said earlier about this, there's a lot of people want to find solutions-based journalism, and there's a lot of talk generally now about solutions-based journalism and that being a positive thing, and that rather than journalists constantly sort of harping on about this is bad and that's bad, it's important to show solutions. But do you think we have to do that with some circumspection?
Yes, I do, but not to the extent that we sort of want to just diss everything. We don't want to sort of make people say, oh, none of these things are going to work, or there are no solutions, or whatever, although it is tempting sometimes to say, look, the one thing I've been persuaded by is businesses saying, those who are brave enough to say that they don't really know what the answer is, and they don't really know what the solution is, but they recognize they need to find solutions, and they need help in that, and they want to engage in the debate. And by some of this target setting, I find kind of really meaningless, that companies and countries obviously, but particularly companies do, because they're not going to be held to these in 20, 30, 40 years' time, particularly, where the leadership is already, in its dotage, and, they're simply not going to be around. And some of them say they're motivated by, the next generation and so on, and so they're to be believed on that score, of course. But, so it's this balance of cynicism about their trajectory, where they are, and so I have time for the ones who are more, I say time, it's not up to me, but you know what I mean, it's more interesting to listen to those who are saying we yes, we're late to this, but we're starting, we're trying, and we're trying to come up with policies, but our policies aren't going to be perfect, and so best is the enemy of good, so I think that that it's really interesting to tell that story, to go with them on that, to find out from them, what are they trying to do, where are they going, where are they starting. The only thing about that is it doesn't lead to clean news headlines, right? It's not a kind of news breaking, top of the homepage journalism. And so in sort of storytelling terms, that's much more complicated and challenging. And so if you have reporters that are sort of trained to bowl up to the news editor on the news desk and put their elbows out. Actually, FT reporters don't do that, but metaphorically speaking, and so I've got to hold the front page kind of thing. There's not that kind of thing, and to what Fatima and others have been saying, that it's the hold the front page news is the people drowning, dying, burning, and if that's always the thing that's on the front page, and some of these other stories, some of the other quests are not, or the unfolding, education of people themselves, their companies, their families, everyone around them. There's not really a place for that, it seems like. So we have to find ways of exploring that, I think. And that's why it's sort of, I have a little bit, it's a little bit tempting to go to the oracles, the Gateses and the Carneys and all these people as though they have an answer. So, there's this complexity of it all. And, Sumitas, who we worked with on a Green Gold Rush series at the beginning of the year, reminds me that one of the issues is the scale of change that's needed is so enormous that it seems impossible. So it's how you break that down is quite challenging, how you have the global view in mind plus the local view.
I mean, I think that sort of takes us to a question that we've had from Anastasia. By the way, if anybody wants to pop questions in the chat, please do. And she's saying, I would like to ask how to make climate reporting less, for want of a better word, gloomy. And I guess that's sort of, we know perhaps that one of the reasons why we haven't had as many people reading this content as we might wish is because sometimes it feels so utterly bewildering and overwhelming and impossible to solve that people have just sort of turned away from it, thinking, I just don't know where to go with this. And perhaps all those sorts of extreme stories have added to that. I mean, Fatima, what's your thought? Can it be made less gloomy? I mean, it's a gloomy situation.
Yes, that is a very big question. Well, that's why I'm so intrigued about, climate solutions, local approaches. What are people here doing on the ground? Because for me, when I go into communities and I talk to people doing interesting things and they're not as depressed, it's very encouraging to me to see what they're doing. And maybe that was the conscious decision to be working on the current long-term project that I'm working on, was I just needed to look at, a sort of positive spin on it because it was getting very, very doom and gloom.
So the project you're working on at the moment is just talk us through that then.
Oh, yes. So, I was intrigued and I challenged myself to look at what are some of the local solutions and to look at not the usual suspects, which is obviously in the rural communities, what farmers are doing. But I was just curious about regular people. And here in the Philippines, what are they doing? And, because there's such a massive demand for infrastructure in developing Asia because the middle class is growing, I was curious to look at architects. because it's not really something you often read about. And, you know, what are they doing? What are the climate solutions that they're providing? And so I've been talking to different architects to see how have they taken the climate challenge and incorporated it into their work. We have these international certifications, the LEED certification, but then, you know, it's kind of weird because then you have this international standard, but how green is it if I have to import all the material from the West? So am I calculating the greenhouse gas emissions in bringing that to the Philippines if everything is imported? And, you know, some of these things don't really make sense in the country. How green is that overall? So I became curious as to what are some of the local approaches? How are people utilizing bamboo, which also has a psychological component because it has this mentality of being a poor material. So if we're talking about, you know, utilizing local solutions, then you have to overcome this psychological barrier that people have because they're jumping income classes. They want to show that they're wealthier. So they want to use cement. They don't want to use bamboo. So then you have that other element of then how do we package this to make this, you know, appealing to the growing middle class? So it's looking at questions like that, looking at how
on a project like that, do you feel it makes the topic less gloomy, for want of better word? Yeah.
Because it feels like you're doing something, you know, you're being active about it as opposed to just being passive.
Yeah, and I mean, I'd like to go to Ugochi next. So you've reported for some, you know, really, really difficult places where you've had both people whose homes are being lost to desertization and also to rising sea levels. You've reported on, I read some stuff that about battles essentially breaking out between people whose land is under threat. I mean, how do you take such serious, really troubling topics and make them accessible and not a turn off to viewers and readers?
Well, it's really a difficult one because, I mean, when you share the pain of people, I think people, naturally humans who are good people, should connect to the pains of people. So when I'm able to, you know, translate what the pain, what they are going through is, then I hope it can, you know, get to people. But it's a difficult challenge, a difficult one to be able to try to balance that out. What I do basically to tell those stories and then find those who are, she said, who are bringing in local solutions. And sometimes I look at the local solutions. A lot of times we see recycling, but how much are we recycling in Nigeria? That's just how much can we even really recycle? And then you see, it's funny, you find Coca-Cola supporting recycling projects in Nigeria, and it doesn't make any sense to me. So you see when and then they have projects where they say, oh, bring 10 bottles, and then they give them sachet of plastics, and then I'm wondering, how does this balance out? How does it make sense? So I think I've deviated a little bit, but what I'm trying to say is that when I tell these stories, I try to, you know, find out people in the communities who are also doing something about their problems. Last time I met someone who was trying to build, you know, he had built a foundation to make it higher, and he keeps going higher and higher, and it's not working. And now he's taking, you know, rocks from building sites to see if he can protect, you know, his area. His little solutions he's trying to do, but it can't do anything for him. He knows actually that in the next 10, 20, 15 years, that home will never be there anymore. And it's a sad reality for many of them.
Okay, that's so I'm going to go to, we've got some fantastic questions coming in, so I'm going to go to some of these. Fiona, I wonder if you could maybe talk to this one from Rebecca. I think it's Rebecca Cole, who says that from the gloomy point, I'd like to ask how to manage the mental toll of reporting on climate change that can have on reporters, and also how to stay impartial rather than veering towards activism, which must be a bit of a challenge for a journalist. Fiona?
I'm not an activist.
So, but how do you avoid veering towards that?
By not being an activist. I'm not an activist. I don't see myself as an activist. I keep myself divorced from activists. I'm not an activist. Not an activist. I mean, I just don't know how to say this any differently. I'm not an activist. I'm a journalist. So I look at this as a journalist looks at a story. I try to write objectively, and I talk to all sides. That does not include talking to climate deniers, because that's a view that's completely contrary to established climate science. But it does involve talking to people who are affected by climate change, people who might be, affected by the transition away from fossil fuels and so on, people who are wary about the impacts of climate change on them and the move to a clean economy on them. But yeah, I mean, I don't know how to express it any more clearly. You can be an activist if you want. Well, if you are an activist, you should declare yourself as such, rather than pretending to be a journalist. I mean, there are activist organizations now who do what they call journalism, and it is journalism to some extent, to the extent that they are uncovering new information. They're uncovering scandals and so on. That's really important, and that's an important aspect of journalism. Doesn't necessarily make them journalists, though. They are activists. They're employed as such. And if they were to, for instance, find information that was contrary to the agenda of the activist organization they belong to, would they necessarily make that information public? I don't know. I think it's really important that as a journalist, you know who you are and what you do. I think it's really important that as a journalist, you don't have clients. I don't have clients. I've never had a client. And that's absolutely key to what a journalist does rather than an activist.
Yeah, thank you. I've got a question here from Charlie Ensel, which I think, Emiliya, might be interesting your views on this one. Do any of the panelists feel that there are particular gender stories within climate change that are underreported?
I guess, I feel that it's interesting to me that in the business world, which I'm mainly focused on, that most of the chief sustainability officers and quite a lot of people who are female, and it's still sort of regarded as something that women are more interested in, and I find that sort of both encouraging and a little bit sort of worrying. As you go higher up the tree, then the more important these jobs become, will they then be dominated by men? I sort of worry, all of those issues come across my mind as I'm sitting in the room. And I've been a business journalist for several decades now, and I have seen how little the gender mix in the room has changed around boardrooms and so on over that time. So I'm a bit intrigued about that. That's from a business perspective. In terms of the impact on women, I mean, I think that's reflected in the fact that quite a lot of our reporting is, I find that we are often quoting women. So it's the same whether it's in the boardroom or outside of the boardroom. We're which is not a bad thing. It's a good thing. But we are certainly speaking to more women that are affected than men that are affected, I would say. And, we have this sort of thing at the FT of trying to have balance of voice in stories because we had so many male voices. And so, it was quite a conscious effort, particularly under Ragula Khalaf as the new editor a couple of years ago. But even beyond that, to have a diversity of voice. And it's not, I find other sections have more of a problem than we have in our climate coverage. So I don't know that that's necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. I just find it intriguing. As I say, I worry that over time, as power politics grows within companies and institutions, that more men will reclaim that ground, and then you'll lose that kind of sense of impact.
So essentially, I'm sort of reading from what you're saying that that you feel that men haven't really deemed it to be sufficiently of interest for a while and have kind of like delegated it to the women, but that now they may.
Yeah, I don't want to offend all the men who have worried and do care and all of that. I just think power structures as such, power structures have been obviously dominated by men, and those power structures have largely ignored climate change as a issue in business and in government. So it's definitely something that they have to catch up on. Yeah.
And no, that's brilliant. But Ugochi, can we go to you and the work that you have done? I mean, how have you seen, or have you seen women being more affected by the impact of climate crisis?
Yes, I have. Psychologically and physically, I've seen them affected by the impact of the climate crisis. Some I've seen stories of women who have, in Africa or where I come from, a lot of women also depend on the men for, for farming, for whatever they're doing. They depend, even to open a bank account, sometimes you need a man. And I've seen crises where the men have been killed or affected and the woman is left with the children. I've also seen that a lot of women and children have to go further and further, for example, to get firewood. I've seen that it affects, how girls get to school. Sometimes the roads are too flooded for them to be at school. Sometimes, they're in their period, and all of these things have a lot of impacts on women. I've also even spoken to women who said they are now afraid of having children, psychological impacts, because they're thinking about what's the future of this child in this community? Is he going to survive the next floods? Is he going to be washed away? So all of these things affect women, from how they get to school, from how menstruation, from how psychological effects, these things affect women. And I've seen women who are responsible for moving. They keep building new homes by themselves. They do all those things with 1, 2, 3 children. When you visit the IDP camps, the internally displaced persons camps, like the story of Benue, where there are clashes between herders and farmers, the IDP camps, you find that there are a lot of women and children. And sometimes these women get raped, on their way to the camps, they get raped by those who have attacked them. And then they have babies who they don't even know who their fathers are. So these are huge, there are huge impacts on women and especially girls, environmental issues on them.
But do you think, though, that those stories that you've just described are still in the wider world being understood as climate crisis issues, or are people still able to box that off as something else are those links being made yet, particularly when you see those stories reported in the West?
No, that's the thing. When this story I'm doing for the Duke University, and they told me, our audience will be really interested in hearing this because they don't know about what you're talking about. They've not heard about this before. They know probably there's a crisis. They've never been able to make that connection between climate change, between the fact that some herders from the north, from Chad, from Niger, sometimes they have to move because of drought and desertification, and they're staying longer. So there's a clash. They're staying far longer than they used to, stay down south. So it's that connection that they try to make. But also interestingly, there are cultural issues and there are, issues that people, for those in the IDP camps, for example, when you tell them, oh, the herders are moving and staying longer because of climate change, they say, no, historically, these people have been trying to take our land. So there's an issue of land grab. There's an issue. They're trying to take our land. They're trying to displace us. So that's what they tell you, the people most affected. So I think that, dig deeper, find out the root causes, find out the history of these people, the history of the quote attackers, the history of those affected, and try to make the connection. Of course, the climate crisis is worsening the situation, in Africa.
And Fatima, from your work, do you feel that it's correct? Is it correct to say that women are being adversely affected, or is it just something that's going to affect everyone?
Oh, absolutely, they're adversely affected. But I think something I wanted to add to what everyone was saying here, I feel one of the challenges is, I always talk about whose voices are heard. I think climate scientists female climate scientists from the developing world are not being heard enough. And they have a lot of very interesting things to contribute. I'd said in my interview about, I'm sure everyone here remembers the Reuters Hot 1000 climate scientists, and there was quite an uproar about that. And in the Philippines, there were only 2 scientists that were included, and one of them wasn't even Filipino. But then, it was really ridiculous because earlier this year, I did a profile on a female climate scientist, and a Stanford study cited her as one of the top 2 scientists in the world. She is one of only 2 executive editors at an Elsevier journal that is women, and she's the only one from a developing country. Now, she's not included on the list. And there's so many other female climate scientists like her who don't get featured, who don't get heard. So this question about whose voices matter, I think, is a very important one.
I think that's interesting. Now, there's a question here. I think that probably goes to from Elizabeth Jeffries, which I think is interesting. Is what question are we trying to solve in this discussion? Is it improving reporting to encourage behaviour change, but then does that potentially lead us into the activism point, or are we just reporting that? So in which case, could we learn anything from the slimming reporting, which is it emphasises the reward rather than the penalty? So have we done enough? I guess the point is that have we done enough in our reporting, and should we change the way we're reporting if we want to get more people to listen and to emphasise the reward? Where should we go? Fiona?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that the lack of climate action up to now has been to do with a lack of reporting, or I don't see this as an issue that, I mean, some people like to blame journalists for this, and they like to blame climate journalists in particular, and to them I would just say go away, because it's not been a lack of reporting or a lack of effort on the part of climate journalists up to now that has held anything back.
So on that point, so lack of action, who do you feel is responsible for that? Is that big business, governments? Is it the masses have just failed to engage with it?
Businesses and governments, the vested interests of the fossil fuel lobbies and other businesses have captured a lot of governments and persuaded a lot of governments that they don't need to act. There's just been I mean, I appreciate this is difficult because what you're talking about is a complete overhaul of the world's entire economic system, which is not something that you can do lightly. But it's not been that journalists haven't been saying this, and it's not been that scientists and others haven't been saying this. I mean, they're not listening to the scientists who are the experts on this, who have been issuing warnings that are ever starker and ever bleaker in the forms of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports. If they're not listening to them, then they're not going to listen to journalists. So I think the people they will listen to, some of them might listen to their voters, but an awful lot of countries in the world, aren't democratic. So where do you go there? Well, I think it's only when they see their own vested interests threatened that they will actually take action. And we are at that point where they can see the effects of extreme weather, and they can see the costs of that on them. They can see the threat to themselves, and I think that is what really makes a difference.
Emiliya, there's a question from Rianne Lubin where she says that should the ecological and climate crisis be front page news every single day, which I think is interesting in the perspective we're coming out of the COVID pandemic, where pretty much I'm just talking about the UK here, for many, many months, every single national print and online organisation pretty much led on COVID, day after day after day. So it does show that we can stick on one story when needs be. Will we ever reach a point where there is that much attention on climate crisis?
Well, I think we already have. Really, it's not I don't think there is certainly in this country, there's not a paper that, daily paper this year, really nothing to do with my being appointed climate editor, because, but this year within a few months of the FT setting up a sort of climate hub, which is where we I deal with every desk and every, it's cross boundaries and sectors and geographies and all sections. Virtually all of the mainstream British media has done something similar in their own way. So I feel like we're already at that point where climate is on the front page, and perhaps that's hastened by COP. I think on our homepage we have our climate section which has been there during the time of COVID, and the Guardian, the other publications. Everyone's really on it. It's not that we haven't been on it, I don't think. I just wanted to follow up on what Fiona was saying about what it takes for people to pay attention, if you like, to something that's been really, a phenomenon for decades. And I think it does come down to that, unfortunately, people only care when they're actually affected. It's basements in West London that flooded, or subways in Manhattan, or and it's not those people over there. It's not sort of people in Bangladesh all the time, or people in places that they've never been and are unlikely to go. That really makes the difference. And there's little that in the media we can kind of do about that, really. It sort of goes to the sort of very fundamental existential point of, do societies get the media and the government they deserve? The fourth estate they deserve. Yeah.
I think that was sort of moving towards the end here. So I want to come back to a final sort of comments on COP, which sort of just are on the horizon this weekend, and what you sort of all feel will be interesting things that you think may come out of it, which you think are going to be very newsworthy points. Ugochi, is any thoughts on COP, or what you hope is going to be discussed and what we're going to be reporting on?
I think basically what is important for us from where I come from is finance, to be able to adapt to these changes, to be able to move away. They easily say, stop gas flaring, stop and move to renewables. But how do we do that? How do we finance it? So for many Africans and many NGOs from Africa, finance is going to be a problem. The same way we financed the coronavirus pandemic and found a solution, the same way that should be handled. Take it seriously. As she said, Germany, who knew Germany would get that kind of flooding about 2-3 months ago? Whoever believed it was going to happen? Germany thought, we're ready for this. We've built our infrastructure, but look at what happened. So it's the same way we've been experiencing this for many years. So I think finance is very important for African countries, in this discussions this year. And how do we, leave no one behind? Let's carry everyone along, wherever you come from, wherever you are. We should carry you along. The same way we've been able to get vaccines to the rural communities everywhere in Africa, it's the same way we should bring this solution, to those who desperately need it. So for me, finance is going to be, a huge conversation. And we know the big companies are always there to try to, mess everything up and delay the discussions. I hope we take it seriously this time.
Fiona, what are you hoping to see as the big news lines out of COP?
Well, I hope that, I'll tell you what I hope about the Cop26 coverage in all media, actually, is that I hope that people take a balanced view, because seeing these things as either a triumph or a disaster, which is what many people are inclined to do, is just awful and doesn't help anyone. We already know, I wrote this weeks ago that COP26 is not going to produce a perfect deal. People were admitting that to me privately, that it's going to fall short of what we need in terms of emissions cuts that will get us to 1.5 degrees. So there's a gap there. It will fall short of where it really needs to be. You can present that as a disaster. It's not a disaster, actually. It's not ideal, but as long as there is still progress at COP26, then it could still be a success. But we need to get away from this kind of, I was at Copenhagen, and other people were writing these stories. Copenhagen is a dismal failure, and it's achieved nothing, and it's a complete wreck, and so on. It wasn't. It was terrible. It was chaotic, and it was full of fights and chaos and recriminations. It was shambolic, but it wasn't a failure in terms of what it produced. It actually produced an agreement. It wasn't a perfect agreement, but it was an agreement. It was the first time that developed and developing countries actually both agreed to take on, in the case of developed countries, cuts to their emissions, in the case of developing countries, curbs to the growth of their emissions. And that was the first time that had happened. So it did actually produce a workable agreement that did actually bear fruit in the forms of emissions reductions in future years. People lose sight of that because of all the drama and so on. It's really important that we don't just come out of COP26. I mean, it could be a failure, it could be a complete disaster, and you know, everyone might end up just saying, oh, you know, so this for enough, it's not worth doing anything on the climate anymore. That's unlikely. It's unlikely to be a complete disaster. The likelihood is that it will be somewhere in between. And this kind of language of you know, triumph and catastrophe that some people will use is just wrong and unhelpful, and you know, just doesn't really describe the reality. It's not proper journalism.
No. So we need that to get that nuance back into all those shades of grey back into the reporting. Emiliya, tell us, what are you looking for out of COP? You know, for the FT, what are you hoping are going to be some of the headlines?
I guess, you know, as Fiona says, you know, climate change is going to continue beyond November 12 and 13. So in many ways, you know, COP seems to me to be a great focusing of attention and mind and energy, but that attention and mind and energy will need to continue well beyond, you know, the first couple of weeks. The one thing I would say that I am a little bit disappointed by, one way or another, is that countries like the one I was born in, Australia, are sort of still grasping onto the idea that fossil fuel production is something that they can continue with, and this sort of bifurcation of Saudi Arabia and Australia and other countries on you know, hanging on to fossil fuels and the others phasing them out. I think seeing that play out is interesting. I had thought that perhaps we would see more headlines about the death of coal. You know, old King Coal's finally dying, but that doesn't seem to be the case either. So yeah, I mean, you know, the UK government says, what is it? Coal, cash, which is finance, cars, trees are their focus. You know, so we'll hear a lot about that, whether that makes front page news or not.
Thank you. And so Fatima, finally, what are you hoping will be the news stories that we see at COP? Or what are the stories that need to be written around COP?
I think everybody kind of already said it. I mean, finance is always the most interesting thing, and loss and damages, of course, is always top of mind for developing countries. So while I don't have wild ambitions for it during COP, being a bit of a pragmatist, you know, just seeing any movement of the needle to advance that conversation and inch closer to a desired outcome. Yeah.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. Thank you very much, everybody, for all the questions. Do go to the Women in Journalism website if you want to read any more of the profiles that we have of these women and others who are working in the environment space. And thank you very much for spending your time. And so, Ugochi, Fatima, Emiliya, and Fiona, thank you very much indeed, and hope to see you all again sometime soon. All right, have a lovely afternoon. Bye.